Good afternoon, and welcome to the Workforce Workplace Disability Summit 2020, Diversity Includes Disability. My name is Jason Hartsfield, Adult Career Services Coordinator with Starkloff Disability Institute. And on behalf of our board and staff, I want to thank you for joining us for our final session in our four-part series to celebrate National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Before we dive in, I want to go over a few of the technical aspects of this event. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel following the session. Please note that captioning and interpreting services are available throughout this presentation. If you need to access either of these features, please refer to the guide sent via email prior to the event. We will also be actively monitoring the Q&A and chat box, so please don't hesitate to ask your questions as they arise. If you see a question from someone else that you would also like to be answered, give it an upvote and we will prioritize it for our Q&A portion of the presentation. We want to thank our partners at the Society for Human Resource Management of Greater St. Louis for co-sponsoring each of this event series. Each webinar is worth 1.25 CEUs for a total of 5 at the completion of the series. A special welcome to all our SHRM members joining us today. Starkloff Disability Institute is dedicated to the full participation of people with disabilities in all aspects of society, and especially the workforce. We help break down the barriers that prevent people with disabilities from achieving their highest potential in the workforce and give employers the tools they need to create an environment that attracts, welcomes, and supports this talented and innovative community. The Workforce Workplace Disability Summit is the only place where employers can find reliable best practices on disability inclusion in the workplace provided by professionals with disabilities. Hosting this webinar with me today is Angie Cody, Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals and Chair of the St. Louis Diversity and Inclusion Consortium. The Diversity and Inclusion Consortium is a forum of D&I professionals to advance diversity and inclusion initiatives and navigate challenges in the St. Louis community. We conclude our webinar series today with the topic, the role your D&I team plays during a crisis. During 2020, companies have faced the dual challenges of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and responding to a national reckoning on race. We are joined today by a panel of D&I professionals from around St. Louis who will be discussing this topic. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Alicia Johnson, Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Centene Corporation. Desiree Coleman, Diversity and Inclusion Executive at a St. Louis-based Fortune 50 company. Jacqueline Jefferson, Systems Leader for Diversity and Inclusion at SSM Health. Rodney White, Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Nestle Purina. And Vincent Fluellen, Chief Diversity Officer for Webster University. Thank you all for joining us today. What inspired this discussion today was the observation among many in our field that a lot of businesses, at least at the start of the pandemic, were pulling resources away from their D&I efforts. Our argument would be that really for a business, your diversity and inclusion team can be one of your greatest assets in times of crisis. And that leads us into our first question. For our panelists, what value did your diversity, equity, and inclusion team bring to your company's response to the challenges we're facing today? And Vincent, you volunteered to start us off with this discussion.
Thanks, Jason. Good afternoon. To Angie and to the panelists, and thanks for having me. At Webster University, where I'm the Chief Diversity Officer, our leadership team was able to really be on the front end of providing thought and consideration. As a member also on our COVID task force, right? And one of the first things that I raised a question around was access and technology, right? Access to technology. And it was a conversation that we needed to have in terms of considering which of our students and staffs were able to even fully access remotely from home and which were not. We were able to provide the necessary supports as a result of that. But what was interesting, of course, is that most everyone at this point has a cell phone, right? And from cell phones, you're able to still access Zoom. And for our students, as related to them, they were able to, in many instances, still access classroom apps, right? But actually writing a paper or completing an assignment on a cell is neither ideal and almost nearly impossible, right? And then when you start thinking about staff and staff's ability to access reports and the necessary components that they were required to do from home as well. That then led, Webster to actually purchasing devices that were necessary to support members of the community, of our students and staff who did not have those technology pieces able to work from home. So we were looking at purchasing additional laptops and Surface Pros. We worked with some of our students to help them assist in gaining Wi-Fi access at home. When I think about our, students who are with disabilities, either physical disabilities or any of the learning disabilities as well, making sure that they too had those resources. And so we have a wonderful team that also focuses primarily on supporting those students. And so they were a part of our conversations as well. When I think about the racial reckoning piece, our approach, it's important for us to also realize that, there are, we think in terms of people of color, right, who are most impacted by this, racial injustice in our country. But let's also not forget that there are people of color who are also living with disabilities. And so for them, not only are they having to deal with COVID, they're also having to deal with the issue of race and racism and the reckoning there. And so, our approach at the university was also really just to take a listening position and really reaching out to our current students, our faculty, our staff, but our alum as well, and hearing their stories. And, those were hard conversations to hear as, they shared some very painful stories of racism and discrimination that they experienced on our campus, sadly, as well as off of our campus. And it has allowed for us to continue to engage in conversations. And there's some wonderful things that we are doing in that regard. And later on, if I have the opportunity, I'll share, but I certainly want to yield space for others to answer this question as well. Thank you.
So this is Alicia with Centene. Just to kind of add on to Vincent, for us at Centene, we saw this as a chance to double down on our efforts. We didn't see this as an opportunity to let up. We knew we really had to come in and be a resource for our employees. We wanted to continue programming that was already underway. We worked to create new programming to help support this new normal of keeping our employees connected, because we know from research, we've seen the isolation that people have been experiencing when it came to COVID. So we wanted to ensure that we were, bringing our employees together. We did this through our employee inclusion groups, Ability, which is our people with disabilities and caregivers group. They put on new activities, new events, and I'll have a chance to talk on that a little bit later. But really, like I said, we wanted to double down on those efforts on what we were able to provide our employees internally. And then also externally as an organization, we announced and convened a group of medical, nonprofit, and community leaders to form our Centene Health Disparities Task Force. And so the task force really is looking at furthering leadership and commitment to ensuring that underserved population has access to care. Because as Vincent mentioned, there are dimensions of diversity here, right? We have people with disabilities, we have people of color with disabilities, we have people that identify as LGBTQ+ that have a disability. So you see that intersectionality. So it was important that we convene this group because we saw that there are populations that are disproportionately affected more than others. And so we did that externally as a way to ensure that we're able to provide that competent care, but also internally that we're here to support our employees through programming and events as well.
And I would just add on, I think that as DNI practitioners, part of the value that we bring is that we stay abreast of trends, that we listen to understand different disparities, and that we are constantly trying to understand where there are opportunities to shore up equity. And so I would say early on, before it was nationally reported, I have been doing a ton of reading around the inconsistencies and the disparities by race. And so was able to alert leadership early and say, hey, here are some things that we should probably be thinking about, and let's be proactive and put things in place. And so I think that, you know, that's another way that D&I practitioners add value, is that in times of crisis, they really are a go-to resource and are able to help the organization navigate.
Oh, this is wonderful. What a great conversation, and so many things that everyone is doing in this time. And it seemed like the D&I community just really kind of came together and put, you know, went all in. And that's great to hear, you know, how the organizations, you know, such as, you know, Centene, and, you know, just doubling down on everything that, you know, to be able to ensure that the employees in the community are in the best possible position. So in saying this, it's like, I think about integration, right? I think about how are you really like being able to integrate these D&I efforts into the response planning and into within your organizations. And Rodney, I would love to hear from you, and, you know, hearing what, you know, Nestle Purina is doing in this area.
Sure. So at Purina, our D&I messaging is basically really integrated into all the responses that we have, both internally as well as externally. In fact, within our crisis planning team, although I don't have anybody on my D&I team that specifically is a part of the crisis management team, we do have representation within that group from our, what we call our ambassador group, which is very similar to ERGs per se. You know, like right now we're working on a project with our brand team, along with our broader Nestle group within the United States market, really to identify any societal issues and determine, you know, how we would respond and speak out on as it impacts our community. One of the things with crisis management plans, it really depends on the particular issue that we're trying to address, and we look at, you know, how it could impact our associates as well as our brand and the community in which we live.
Thank you, Rodney. Jacqueline, you know, SSM was in a really unusual spot because you had just launched your first disability hiring event right before everything shut down because of the pandemic. So I'm wondering if you can lead us on our.
You just muted.
Sorry about that. I was holding down the space bar and then I switched to my list of questions and it just started throwing a bunch of spaces in there. But Jacqueline, what have you done to sustain SSM's commitments during this time?
Well, I think the realization from all of this, what we've learned is that this could not be business as usual. That's the first thing that we've talked about as it relates to our D&I efforts. And yes, you're right in that, yes, we launched one of our core events to be replicated across all of our regions, Missouri, Illinois, and Oklahoma, which was a dedicated career fair solely for individuals with disabilities. As we do know, the realization is that this pandemic has really magnified the inequality challenges with not only individuals with disabilities, but also other racial ethnic minorities, women, and persons of color. But that career fair, we were fortunate in that we were able to get that career fair off. We had a great participation rate in that career fair, but what happened was we actually seized upon this crisis as an opportunity to really build and keep going. And we could only do that by the support of our leadership council that allowed us to keep going with those strategies that we had already put forward. The career fair was just one particular segment of our ability forward career model that we have. And so we have continued to march forward. We were able to hire several individuals from that career fair. And now we were fortunate in that we have a robust talent pipeline that we have actually been working constantly from that day forward. But I have to say that it was definitely a huge impact. But I think in terms of a crisis, it is really how how the organization responds to the crisis to really show the true fabric and character of that particular organization. So last week, we are remaining flexible in this pandemic. We conducted our virtual career fair as well. And so we're currently also reaching out to hire some of those individuals from that fair as well. So we are continually, we realize we have to be flexible during this pandemic as well, and continue to communicate and reinforce our values of who we are, which is simply aligning with the mission of reaching out to those communities, reaching out to those underserved and populations that are underprivileged. So we are still aggressively working to continue with some of our programs that's under our Ability Forward career model.
If I could add on, similar to Jacqueline's organization, at Purina, it was very important that we honored the commitments that we made even prior to the pandemic, because there were several programs that we had invested in, community partners that we were working with, that we really felt strongly that we needed to continue that effort, because everybody was hurting during this period of time. And so, in fact, we had to, as a DNI organization, we really had to pivot in everything that we did, because we're used to doing everything pretty much in person. And so now we had to transition everything to a virtual platform. And in fact, one of our first events that we had to transition to a virtual environment was a Starkloff Stream Big event. And so it was working with Starkloff to figure out, okay, how do we make this work? Because we were so used to, for years having students come on our campus and experience the culture of what was going on at Purina's site, in terms of bringing in the incredible dog show team to kind of to have those types of events. And we have a lot of exhibits there where people can touch and do those kind of things. And all of a sudden we're now locked into this virtual environment, and so we had to pivot. And I think it went well. We got some good reviews in terms of moving it to a virtual environment. So we had to be agile in everything that we did. So it was it's been an interesting ride, I must say, and I think we learned a lot from that experience in terms of what can we do when we hit those types of crises to continue to make things work and to continue to support the community.
Rodney, I think that's a great point. I'll just add on that I really believe that COVID in many ways forced us to innovate how we do our work. To your point, we had a way, like, the summit is this day, or it's happening, in this way, and here's the plan for it. And so it really kind of made us reimagine. And I think in some ways it made us more inclusive. So within my organization, I work for a particular line of business. And so, we were planning and executing events just for them, but having to go virtual sort of made us pause and say, like, who else can we extend this to? How can we be even more inclusive? And so I do think that was at least one good thing that came out of all of this.
And just to build on Desiree's point, Rodney, you also mentioned talking about our community. We have really stepped up our efforts or enhanced our efforts in terms of going into our community and finding our community partners, agencies, and providers. We're no longer waiting on them to come to us to seek out partnerships. We are looking to go to those organizations to build that structure and that partnership that we're looking for to help sustain us during this pandemic as well.
And not to keep us on this question for too much longer, but just to kind of piggyback back to what Jackie mentioned, right? This is how the company responds. And I would say if this was not something that was important to the organization, this could be an excuse to not move forward, right? And so you have to sustain, the activities that you have going on, right? We had things planned, and so we continue to push forward. And as Desiree mentioned, this was an opportunity for us to innovate and really accelerate some of the things that probably were going to happen eventually anyway. This was the 30th anniversary for the ADA, so we had big activities planned, but we did not scale back. We pushed forward and found ways to be innovative in order to to ensure that we're able to capture and make things accessible for our full workforce.
And I'd like to just add one more thing. As we're talking about the crises and going out into the communities, one thing internally, the realization, of course, SSM, health and wellness is what we do. The realization of the impact on the health and wellness of employees, including those with disabilities. One of the things we wanted to do was we wanted to make sure that a lot of those resources that were becoming available were also established and put forward so that individuals with disabilities can have access to know about those resources and valuable and pertinent information. So we actually created an internal portal it was actually for all of our staff. With valuable resources about how to maintain your health and wellness during this time. And so we have been sustaining that portal and adding additional information, videos, topics that will allow easy access for individuals with disabilities as well as our staff.
This has been a great conversation. As you can see, I'm just nodding along, like, because there's so many things that we can spend all day talking about the negative impacts of what's happened. But when we turn it and we sit there and talk about the opportunities that, you know, we're taking what's given to us, things that we do not have control over, and we turn it into an opportunity for, you know, to open up the conversations further, to, you know, provide additional access, and to many of, you know, to Desiree's point, and to many of you, you know, like, we did things in a particular way. We, you know, we're going to sit in-house and we're going to do this, and things kind of stayed in a particular box or a region or area. And if anything, this has really opened up the conversation for us to really look across our organizations to be able to, you know, bring more people in, to create programming and initiatives that are more inclusive. So, you know, Alicia, I know you went into this, you know, some of the opportunities and things. Are there other things that, you know, other new opportunities that kind of developed out of everything that's happening in our environment today?
Yeah, definitely. So we really, you know, look to work with our employee inclusion groups. So we call them EIGs. A lot of companies call them BRGs, but so we look to work with our employee inclusion groups. And so really looking at, you know, how our employee population is affected, you know, pretty much in any way you can think of, right? You think about parents juggling work and virtual learning for their kids. I don't know if you guys saw, I had to like push my little virtual pre-K out the door. He came in from my cell phone, right? So we're juggling that, right, with work. And so, you know, really looking at ways and programming that we can, you know, be creative and bring forward. We also engaged our Centene National Disability Advisory Council. And so this is an external council that Colleen Starkloff chairs for Centene that brings together subject matter experts in the disability space around what can we do when it comes to our employees, product offering for our employees. So we engage this group to really look at new ways that we can evaluate, ways that we can, again, be there and support our members throughout this crisis. But really wanted to spend a little time around what we did internally for our employees. And so, as I mentioned, Ability is our people with disabilities and caregivers employee inclusion group. And so they got creative, right? We thought about ways that we can bring folks together. And so one way they did that is through cross EIG networking social events. And so it's just offered a couple of times a month for a few hours that allows employees to just kind of drop in and drop out and connect with one another. And so they did a great job of reaching out and engaging with different EIGs. So we have Mosaic, our people of color, Inspire, our women's network, SendVet for veterans and military family, and then C-Pride for LGBTQ+. And so again, we know the intersectionality. So Ability was really intentional about reaching across the aisle and saying, okay, let's do this together and just be a place where people can connect and just unwind, because a lot of times people just needed a chance to just talk, right? Like, it didn't need to be a specific program to develop you. It was just a chance to say, hey, Angie, how are things going? Let's talk, right? And so we found that to be very impactful. And this wouldn't have come to fruition if it wasn't for COVID. Another thing that they did was they looked at the Black female mental health. And so there was a series that they created around that, because again, we're talking about the intersectionality. Like, how are people of color affected? How are women affected? And bringing that together and having a conversation, and brought in some subject matter experts on the material. And so again, it was just a way for us to think through these activities that, back to Desiree's point, right? If we would have done this pre-pandemic, it would have probably been in the auditorium, been limited, right? But this is a way for us to broadcast it across our entire employee population, for people to get engaged and learn more about how they can be an ally and how they can support their colleagues throughout this pandemic.
I like the point that, to build on Alicia's point, I like the point where talking about the internal engagement for the employees during both social unrest times as well as this pandemic crisis. I think one of the things that we have, one of the things that we've rolled out, we are leveraging our leaders and getting our leaders most certainly involved, but we have rolled out a segment called Leaders as Healers. And so in this particular format, just back to Alicia point, is that using this platform to really simply allow people to talk about things they're feeling, things that are going on, with them, the change in their lives. And so positioning this segment for our leaders, allowing our leaders to really integrate and engage with the employees as well. For our individuals with disabilities, I talked earlier about reaching out to the community. We have established some great partnerships with many, I'm quite sure many of folks attending in this audience, with agencies and service providers. And we are identifying ways to help support them during this pandemic. One of the things that is critical for individuals with disability in terms of employment is being able to go out and discover, explore possible career opportunities with organizations. The pandemic has shut all of that down. So this week, actually today, we actually launched our Ability Forward virtual career discovering exploration. So allowing individuals to come on virtually to talk to managers face to face, understand what a day in the life is for somebody in the lab. So again, just looking for ways to follow and find different opportunities during this pandemic.
And one thing I'll add really quickly is we really utilize our employee inclusion groups as, our kind of foot soldiers. They have their ear to the ground. They hear what people are looking for. And so one way that we utilize them was, talking to them and say, hey, what are some benefits? What are some things that we need to consider as an organization? And so through those conversations, through those focus groups, we've had the ability to improve some of our benefit offerings, whether it's increasing the number of therapy sessions or counseling sessions through our employee assistance program, offering benefits, additional days to support individuals, family members that may have contracted COVID or themselves have gotten COVID. So being able to have more time off in order to be able to support that. Also, stipends. We've offered tutoring services to our employees' kids. And so really tapping into our EIGs to recognize what are those things that we can do to better support our employees during this time, I think has been really critical.
One thing I think, Alicia, you brought to mind for me was just the value of human connection, and that we are missing that at this time. And so when last week we hosted an event, and sort of similar to what you described, we did some virtual, like a virtual reception, and people got to talk and just see their colleagues' faces who they hadn't seen for many, many months. And so I do believe that as we talk about like supporting folks and, designing workplaces of the future and thinking about what people need as we come back to work, I really think it's equally important to consider what people need now and how to keep those bonds and connections strong.
Yeah, so Desiree too, I think actually seeing Alicia yesterday. I hadn't seen her in a while. Her and I have partnered together on some of the things from a former employer with Centene. But I'm just thinking about my own reactions to when I saw her yesterday, and again bringing that to the forefront, talking about that human interaction, how much that is needed. We have introduced what we call coffee talks, which simply is 10 to 15-minute virtual interactions to, again, reconnect, talk, share, reflect, lend support to one another, especially during this time. So it was awesome to see Alicia. I've seen Jason a couple of times before, and Angela as well. And Desiree, I think I saw you some months ago on a different panel. So most certainly that human reaction most certainly resonates to us, and I'm quite sure as well as our employees.
I think another piece to this is that it's afforded us an opportunity to kind of really look in terms of what type of training and development that we have available, not just for our associates, but also for our leaders. And so we're looking at implementing an inclusive leadership series to help leaders figure out, how do I speak to my associates in these types of situations, because that was a missing piece. And we also had sessions with our associates where we had that difficult conversation. And what bore out of that was the fact that there were a number of leaders who really didn't understand what their associates were going through, what their teammates were going through, or how to really have that conversation with them. And so we're looking at ways to kind of help them develop as well in order to have those good conversations with their employees.
Rodney, I think that's so important because I was actually just listening to a colleague today who, really sort of noted that after, all of the racial upheaval and the conversations, the guidance was managers go talk to your team. But that didn't necessarily mean that people were equipped to have those conversations or had the tools in their toolboxes to be able to guide their team through effective discussions, reflections, or even that they themselves had a really clear understanding of the breadth of issues at hand. So, Jason, I know one of the things you wanted us to talk about is the value of Dni teams. Like, these are the critical moments where, where Dni teams, I think, can add tremendous value. And I would say to my colleagues, I don't know if you felt this way, but I feel like we've been, in the trenches, plugging away, presenting plans, presenting, efforts for many, many years. And then, following the death of George Floyd, I really felt like a floodgate opened up and a willingness to, have conversations that we never had was something I was like, oh my gosh, like, are we having this conversation? So I'm just curious also to the folks on the panel, like, how did you sort of think about seizing that moment and what did that mean for you?
You're exactly right, Desiree. So I'll say that we definitely saw this as a chance to be there for our employees, right? Because so many years we've been taught you have to leave things at the front door, or I guess in this instance, before you walk to your computer, however you want to think about it in the pandemic moment. But we can't, that is a part of who we are, right? And so for us, in response to the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless others, we set up a day of dialogue. And so during these conversations, we really talked about, addressing those social determinants of health in our entirety, right? Systematic racism, inequity, all of that, right? Because we know that it's impacting our employees, right? And so it's important that we talk about it, because when you don't talk about it, you can just get to the point where you explode, right? It is just so much coming at you at one given time. And so another thing that we've done is we offer unconscious bias training as well. And so that was done in person. And so, of course, we had to pivot when it came to the pandemic, because we felt that this was still something important for us to understand, right? We have to understand, what are those blind spots that we exhibit, especially for our people leaders, right? Are we not hiring people because they have a disability? Because we're not blind, so we don't understand how a blind person can do their job. We're not deaf, so we don't understand how a deaf person can do their job. So we have to talk about those blind spots. And so it's important for us as an organization that we kept those conversations going. And it's an interesting point, Desiree. I just did a training on Friday, and I had someone say, you know what, I'm proud to be a part of an organization that is allowing us to talk about these human feelings that we have, right? And it's important for us to understand that we're all human, so we all have biases, but we have to unpack it and understand how those biases can then land on people and affect their lives, right? Affect who gets the job, affect who gets promoted, affect who, is able to continue to have these conversations moving forward. So I'm glad you brought that point up, because that's something that we saw as an opportunity and saw as a responsibility as an organization that we had to lean in and have those conversations about.
I too appreciate you raising that. I think that all of us on this panel are finding ourselves, more busy than ever, right? Either being invited onto panels or leading within our organizations in ways in which, as you said, Desiree, we've been knocking at the door for a long, long time. And now people are actually ringing us up saying we need help. They now recognize that. And, to me, if we are to find something good and positive out of the killings of these unarmed Black folks, right? Like, this moment right now really is huge in terms of the work of DEI within organizations, right? I think every organization at this point realizes its importance, right? Now, it might be the very first step that they're taking, or it allows, as I'm listening to Alicia and others, to move that needle forward in such a tremendous way. At the university, what I have found to be most exciting for me is the fact that schools and departments within schools are now examining their own curriculum, right? Every Friday, I think about our music department. Every Friday, I started back at the start of the school year, and I spoke to the music department and challenged them to do some self-reflection. And out of that conversation, 2 faculty members have now formed a larger group of faculty members, as well as a couple of students. And every Friday for an hour, they explore and talk about redesigning their curriculum, right? And they have homework the week before that's all tied to this discussion. Our HR department is having conversations now with me in a different kind of way, right? We are trying to get a real sense of what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like on our campus, right? From my perspective, I certainly have a thought on that, but what do my colleagues think about that? And again, broadening that definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion beyond just that of race, right? And how do we show up for and on behalf of, the marginalized, LGBTQ, the individuals with disability, the mental health, right? And how do we show up and provide support for not only one another as colleagues, but for our students, right? And you have to recognize, for us, it's our students that really make us, without our students, we don't exist, right? And so how do we first give priority and attention to meeting their needs? Alicia, you talked about the mental health piece, right? And I know prior to the start of this conversation, some of us were talking as well. Mental health for us, the rate in which our students are now seeking assistance because of isolation, right? Like, we have some on-ground classes, but we also have a lot of virtual classes. And students, even if they're on ground, because of restrictions, they have to then make their way back basically to their dorm room, right? And they are living in isolation. That's not how freshmen were anticipating coming to college, right? Especially after having ended their senior year of high school under this as well. And so the rate in which our counseling department is being utilized has been, sadly, it's high, right? And we understand why. But we've also been really clear to also make sure that we bring on counselors who are able to connect and identify with a broader population as well. And then obviously our staff, it's an issue of concern as well. And so they're receiving their resource or assistance through, the employee assistance programs as well. But we're busier than ever now.
And I'm just going to jump in and take that busier than ever point from Vincent, in that, yes, we are busier than ever. And we're working across all spectrums within the organization. I can appreciate the fact that people are really seeking us out now to get that support that they need to have some of these crucial conversations, to work across understanding how to bring individuals with disabilities within their organization. So we are working with our HR folks, chaplains, nurses, throughout all of the organization. Now, it's only 2 of us, and so we are a lean working machine, but I can really appreciate the people that are seeking us out to help and support and build this infrastructure as we continue to grow.
Can I just add one other thing? Which
Go ahead.
is, Vincent, when you talked about counseling services, I think as we talk about like folks on the margin who have, those intersection identities, I think this is a period of time where cultural competency and counseling and in providing mental health services is paramount, right? Because one size does not fit all. And I think understanding where people are coming from and their lived experience and, maybe some of the trauma or baggage that they may bring, I think is increasingly important.
That lived experience is really critical, right? And I think that, again, as a result of the racial reckoning that's taken place, we are able to broaden the appreciation of what those lived experiences are, right? Be it those who are with disabilities. I mean, that's a whole world that, I'm blessed to be temporarily able-bodied right now, right? And that's not my world right now, right? But I still have to value the lived experience of those for whom it is their world and their reality. And I can find empathy and compassion and understanding based on what my lived experience is as a Black gay man in America, right? And the challenges that I have to face in navigating this, right? And so then, I think that this is just such an opportunity for us. If we don't seize it right now and capitalize on it, we will be missing opportunities to create pathways forward for all people who have challenges in their lives. And let's be clear, that's almost all of us, right? And so there's some benefits that if we don't operate and try to do better within our organizations, we're going to be revisiting this over and over. It'll just change the lens of what the issue is. Today it's race, tomorrow it'll be, those in wheelchairs, and the day after that it'll be women, and the day, it'll be the LGBT. But if we just right now just package it up as an issue for diversity, equity, and inclusion of all, we'd be so much better. I'd love for us to be out of a job.
That's a great sentiment. It's the same thing I was taught back in social work school. Vincent, you're really speaking to something. It's a question that's come in on the chat. We're getting a lot of great questions, by the way. And I want to fold it into kind of like our planned wrap-up question of, all right, so all of these great opportunities are happening right now. What happens when the pandemic is over? How do you, as what this person says, how do you turn this from a moment into a movement? And I'm especially thinking about those smaller to mid-sized companies. Those are our biggest employers nationwide. What do they do? How do you, what would you tell someone who's like an HR of one that they need to do, or a larger company that maybe doesn't have this dedicated diversity, equity, inclusion effort? What advice would you give them?
So I would say, so when you think about a movement, you think about grassroots, right? So you think about, where does that come from? It comes from the people themselves. So I would say a smaller, mid-sized company, go out, ask your employees, what is it that you need? And let's work on that, because that's where you're going to get the momentum to kind of keep this going, because the people who are involved and who are invested in this are the ones that are going to keep it going. So that's where I would start.
I think to add to Rodney's point, that grassroots movement, really kind of identifying your landscape on the inside of what's important from an internal capacity. But I would also say one very valuable thing that I've learned in working in DNI is it is critical to build that infrastructure. Once you've identified the important issues, it's really critical to build the infrastructure. I think where I see why I have observed some companies, they are wanting to get their DNI efforts going. And so you have all these one-offs. And so, but not meaningfully connected to really the overall strategy of the organization or the outcomes, nor having that leadership support. That's a song we all on this panel know. We sing this song, but it is a song that is critical to starting, initiating your D&I efforts. So that infrastructure, understanding your landscape and where you want to go. You know, what's important, where you want to go. It's lots to work on. So it's there's no deficit in that area.
I would add to that in terms of infrastructure, it also requires having a diverse body of employees, right? And so Alicia's talked to this wonderful conversation around their EIGs, right? Their employee inclusion groups, right? Well, if they don't have an inclusive or diverse group of employees, the EIGs don't exist. And sadly, and we know this to be true, many organizations do not reflect the screen in which I'm looking at right now, right? There lacks diversity within organizations, certainly at leadership positions to help guide those organizations. And so I would actually challenge organizations also at this point to think about their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what it means to go beyond just a mission statement or just a tagline or just a hashtag, right? But that they are intentional, that they are deliberate, and that they're thoughtful about and committed to expanding the diversity of their leadership as well as workforce, and to then listen to the voices and stories of those who come forward, right? Because as Desiree has spoken of, those lived experiences are true, real, and should help to inform and guide decision-making within the organization.
I want to answer that question, but
go ahead.
now I was going to say, I'm going to do like a 3-part answer, if that's okay, because I saw a couple of questions come in the chat that I want to respond to. So one person asked about like accommodations in this season. And I know that we were talking a little bit about it earlier, which is like, as people return to work, what does that look like? So if you have a medical condition that makes you really, really vulnerable, like what does that look like in the age of COVID? And so I do think that there is space to ask for accommodations based on that. And that could be, you know, an extended period to work from home or some other arrangement with your employer. But I do think, you know, that's worth pursuing and something you should definitely ask. And then, you know, someone asked about ERGs and sort of doing pulse surveys of their entire organization. And I'll sort of say my advice would be that what you measure matters, right? So nothing gets done in your organization that is meaningful without having some measurement. So I do think broadly, pulse surveys can give an overarching view of where folks sit. Recognize that information may be a little bit biased because, you know, people may be reticent to check like, I hate it here, this place is terrible, you know, so you may get the, you know, fully satisfied. But there is data from Gallup that suggests that about 58% of workers across America are disengaged. And so shout out to Angie, Cody for talking about disengaged workers. And so I think it's important to measure it and to do other things to gather that data. So that's maybe where having some focus groups with your employee resource groups might be helpful. And depending on your organization, if those employee resource groups are organized by diverse segment. So I know that some folks have one big catch-all organization, others are divided by segment. Just recognize that you're getting a view based on people's proximity to that experience or their allyship to that experience, and those are individuals, so it may not represent the full breadth of that entire community. So that's just what I would add.
And I'll say you have to understand your organization, right? So what works for one organization won't work for another. You have to understand where you are on this continuum. But I think it's important to understand like what's going on right now is what's going on right now. but your employees are not going to turn off their feelings or their lived experiences that they have. So it's important that you're capturing, this feedback that you're hearing from your employees and continue to build up this business case to understand that it's not about right now jumping on the bandwagon because this company said they're going to do X, Y, Z. You have to be doing it because you see it moving, and it has to be about your strategy. So, we say all the time, DNI is not, you don't bolt it on at the end. Right, the way that it truly works is it's a part of your organization's strategy, right? Because we know diversity and inclusion fuels innovation. And the reason that it fuels innovation is because if we take all of our differences and we leverage them, right, to make people feel included, that's when you get those different perspectives. That's when you get those different lived experiences. So you have to be sure that, again, you're taking notice to where your organization is on the continuum, what your employees are looking to do, and how you can then accomplish those goals. Because again, 2020 is going to end, but the things that have been brought to the surface are not going anywhere. So again, it has to be a part of who you are as an organization going forward.
Yeah, I actually cannot agree with you more on that. It's the fuel, the innovation, the diversity is the fuel for the innovation. And there's so many exercises out there that, to be able to really showcase that. And but I want to almost take a little bit of a step back, just a minute about that question from a moment to a movement, because we've been seeing a lot of that out in a lot of talk about making sure this becomes a movement. And I would love to hear from you. What stakes in the ground are you putting out there for your organization? Hearing about the integration of the concepts throughout the organization through HR, integration of DNI concepts, and, in all parts of our talent management area and within the business. But are there any specific stakes that you're putting into the ground now to ensure that this is a journey for your organization and isn't just, hey, this is what we're going to talk about today, but tomorrow we're going to talk about something different?
That's a good question, Angie. And so for us, I think part of it is training. So it's looking at that education, that awareness, looking at what are these learning journeys? How do we continue to bring awareness to our leadership? Because we want to start with leaders because they cast a shadow, right? They are setting the tone for their department, for their environment. So it's important that, we're working with them to ensure that they understand, what they say matters, right? It's important that people often don't know that sometimes, we're talking about the tone, or you're talking about, people not feeling included. Maybe it's as simple as you're always going to the same person, for the assignments, right? And then we're also working with our talent attraction team when it comes to hiring, right? Where are we sourcing our talent? Because if we're going to the same pond all the time, we're going to yield the same results. So, whether it's, working with Disability In or working with Reaching Out NBA or all of these diverse organizations, we have to ensure that we're casting the net wide, right? And so those are some of the things that we're looking at. We're looking at training. We're looking at who are we sourcing, who are we attracting, who are we hiring. We're looking at who are we promoting. We're looking at our succession plans. We're looking at our organizational talent reviews. So we're looking at all of these to see where the bias creeps in. And so we're spending a lot of time as an organization on bias just because it's just something that people don't realize how it influences and impacts the decisions that they make every day. And so for us, that's kind of where our flagship training is right now, is exploring those blind spots. And it's amazing, as we're going through these trainings, the feedback that we're getting from our leaders, like, wow, like these aha moments. They don't realize, what that can, how that can impact people. And just really quickly, one story I always share is when I was back in recruiting, Starkloff, they used to have training. I don't know if they still do it, but we brought in Starkloff to do training for our recruiting team. And I never will forget, I worked with Susan. We did mock interviews. And I remember asking Susan during the mock interview, is there something that you didn't get a chance to say during the mock interview that you would like to share? And so she said, yeah. She said, a lot of times what people say is what you see is what you get. She said, but when people see me, they see limitations, and I'm not limited. And I share that every time I do one of our unconscious bias trainings, because we always put barriers on people. We do it all the time. We don't even realize it. We're putting barriers and limitations on people that don't exist. And back to our accommodation process, we have an organization-wide accommodation process. And so it is there for a reason, because if we're able to equip people with the tools that they need to succeed, they can be more successful than anybody else on that team. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to drive home and bring awareness to our people.
We actually still do that, in case anyone is
I love
interested.
it. A plug for the training then. It was great.
I think to build on Alicia's point, we are also honing in on our training and educational components, as well as we are building out our cultural advisory teams, in which we will be driving a lot of our mission-driven initiatives, DNI initiatives, through those actual teams. We have been really heavily working with our recruitment team as well, reaching out to look at and bring aboard leaders of color. And back to Vince's point, equipping the organizations with people that look like one another. And so those are some of the things that we are currently doing as well.
I hate to, this is all such wonderful information. I think I really appreciate also Alicia, you brought up the business case, because I think that's always what it comes back to when you're talking to leaders. Well, what's the business case for this? And the thesis of this conversation was your diverse companies are more resilient companies. That was, that what we talked about with the webinar that we did 2 weeks ago, really the webinars we've been doing throughout this month. We have a question coming in. What about, so this is the boring question, right? But it's the important one, budgets. A lot of companies were freezing budgets when the pandemic started because, some companies really lost a lot as a result of the pandemic. Did you see your budgets frozen at this start? And how would you suggest a DNI office sort of navigate that?
I think Desiree said it in part, right? You measure what is important, right? And you invest also in what is important. I certainly recognize, as of now, my budget has not been frozen because it was approved in the last fiscal year, right? And we're just operating under those dollars still. Now, as we move into the new fiscal year, I anticipate there being some shifts, but I also see those shifts being across the, kind of equitable, right? This work matters to my university, right? And so therefore I expect my university to continue to support this work financially, right? And making those financial commitments to ensure that this work can continue. And in all honesty, I believe it now more than ever. And I think that organizationally, I think more and more people have now bought into the importance of this work. I think in terms of donations, I host a bi-weekly show as a result of the killing of George Floyd called Webster Speaks, Dialogues on Race, Equity, and Inclusion. And when people are registered for that free session, they have an option of making donations. I have received several $1,000s worth of donations on a series that I think we're only on like episode 10 or 11, right? And that has been across the board in terms of donations coming in for DEI work at the university. I would anticipate that, our CFO and my president and my chancellor and our board will also continue to value and recognize that. I do anticipate, of course, some bit of a reduction, but I don't anticipate it to get to the point in which I'm like running around like with the, standing on a corner, asking folks to buy some cookies, right? To help do this work. And so I anticipate it, but I think now more than ever, they have made us, you talk about what stake in the ground I have. I think as an organization, it has placed a stake in the ground. And in so doing, it must then provide that support.
And I think to add to Vincent's point, the stake in the ground is all of the current issues that we currently have going on, and as a responsibility, as an organization responsibility back regarding those, a lot of those issues, social inequalities, diversity within our communities, individuals with disabilities. And it's interesting you talked about this budget discussion a couple of weeks ago, working on forecasting the budget for 2021. The way that we've proceeded in putting our budget together is to support currently the initiatives that we have going on right now. That includes our individuals with disabilities, our veterans with disabilities, our veterans in general, our leaders of color, our community partnership, as well as sponsorships. So we are taking, that's the stance that we're taking. We're marching forward and putting forward the components of our budget that align with our current strategy. So we're moving forward with what we have and what we're going to introduce to our leaders.
Say very similar to what Jacqueline and Vincent had said. Right at this point, there haven't been any changes to our budget. And I'm thinking more like this. DNI is really about caring about people, right? And so as an organization, it's within our DNA to ensure that we support our communities and the partners within our communities. And so again, I don't anticipate us losing any momentum along those lines, and to be able to continue to support the DNI initiatives that we have within the organization.
I would also say, to Rodney's point, and Vincent as well, I think I might be expecting some monies to be added to the budget. We have a huge platform of work to do that we have committed to. And that budget actually serves as a way of commitment to our DNI effort. It does take money to move these efforts and move within our communities and do the things that we want to do within the organization. So I want more. If any of my leaders are on the line, I want more.
I love that, Jacqueline. And I really, there's a saying that budgets are a moral document. So, to the degree to which you put your money in spaces, it, really matters. And I think, I saw a question in the chat about like, how do you pull people off the floor and how do you engage people, who have to work? I have a colleague who works in diversity and inclusion at T-Mobile, and their board and CEO talked about the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion. They have 3 call centers nationwide. They shut call center down one by one to have dialogues and to take people through training. So I really do think that, there's a way to build in overtime. There's a way to kind of do some split shift. There's a way to time it to where you can have some overlap. So I do think that, having these conversations is critical, and leadership has to be creative about how that gets done. It's possible though.
I love that, Desiree, because where there's a will, there's a way, right? So I think a lot of times some people see this as a cop-out, right? Like, oh, we can't do that, right? The way that our organization is structured, we can't do that. So it's important, back to the point of understanding your organization and then being innovative, right? How can you do these things? Because again, if anything, this time has shown us that this work is necessary. And for us at Team, we're fortunate enough that we don't see this slowing down, right? We see this as a way to continue to drive and push things forward. And for our managers and leaders to understand that our DNI team is not a team of 6. It's a team of 70,000 plus employees, because diversity and inclusion is the responsibility of all, right? So that's first. And our CEO, he says that at our town halls, and he is a big champion of the diversity and inclusion space and understands the importance behind it. So I think that's key, right? You have to ensure that your leadership is on board so you can continue to move that forward, because as we say all the time, as Desiree said, what gets measured gets done. So that's where you got to put your money where your mouth is. So.
There's so many T-shirt worthy comments coming out of this discussion. I love it. Budgeting is a moral document. What was the other one that really stuck out to me? DNI is people are part of our DNA. If there was a phrase, Rodney, that I wanted to tell a company that said, how do I get started in DNI? That's what I would say is DE&I needs to be in your DNA. It's just a foundational good business practice. And I appreciate, Desiree, you keeping an eye on the chat. I want to come back to that question that you addressed. The question is about a person who works for let me see if I can make sure. I work at a senior living organization where more than 95% of our employee population is on the front line serving older adults. Do you all have any thoughts about how to create spaces for these folks who are often Black or brown and need to be heard? The pushback so often is that there isn't any time to pull them away from their jobs. So what would you suggest someone do
I think-
with that pushback?
I think it goes back to Desiree's point, the example that she gave with T-Mobile, right? You have to understand the workforce, and they have to want to do it. If they don't want to do it, it's not going to get done. Honestly, that's the key, right? And so it goes back to the point of the business case, right? What are employees looking for, and bringing that information to leadership and saying, this is what they're looking for. And I will say, you know, I always have a leader that says, just don't bring the problem, bring a solution as well. So if you see there is an issue, what do you think can be done, right? And taking that to leadership and say, okay, here is what I'm hearing, here are the issues, here are our challenges, and this is what I suggest, right? And so can we work through this? Can we get a task force? Can we start, you know, bringing a group of employees together and really bring to them, you know, what the issue or challenge is, but also a potential solution for the problem as well.
I would add to Alicia's point there also, not only, I mean, you have to also recognize people of color tell these stories constantly, you know, like live it also. So they are also tired, right? And so sometimes I just want to come to work to do my job, period, right? There are other times in which I may want to come to work, tell a story, and be a part of a solution and helping to solve a larger issue. And so the employer has to also recognize and have to deal with, hey, do you really want to know? Do you really want to know what your Black and brown folks are thinking and feeling, right? Because the moment in which they tell you, whether they offer solutions or not, is the moment in which you have to be prepared to somehow minimally respond with an acknowledgement of that story, period, right? And many times, this is true not just in workforce spaces, this is just life. When people of color or people who are marginalized tell their stories, often those who are in the privileged position challenge it, they question it, they say that's not true, they say you're being sensitive, they say da, 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 right? Instead of just honoring it. And so that's another bit of like, if I weren't traumatized already by the initial story and the experience that happened to me repeatedly, by the way, right? And I now share it and you now dismiss it, what makes you think I want to come back and tell you another story? What makes you think I actually want to become a part of the solution? Because you're going to always challenge it, right? And so first, I think the place of employment and the leaders there need to really do some of that bias training that we've heard about here too, right? Some of that implicit bias, some of that like just being able to listen, some of that those social work skills, right? Of just listening, right? And being able to validate, because otherwise, your colleagues of color or those who are marginalized and other identities are going to come forward and you're going to dismiss it. They're not coming back. They're not coming back to talk about that. They truly will just become your workforce who will be disengaged and will find a way to check out and find what's next and new for them.
Vincent,
go
I
ahead, Desiree.
all right. Thank you, Rodney. So I just learned a term last week. Y'all may have already been so aware of it, but racial gaslighting, which is what you talked about, Vincent, where people share their story, share their experience, and their credibility is challenged, their interpretation of the event is challenged. And so it creates this dialogue where, you know, the people who have actually experienced it now have their experience called into question. So I would just recommend that, you know, for anybody who is wanting to learn and to grow, just Google that term. There are a ton of articles from BBC, many others. And I also just want to touch on your point, because following the death of George Floyd, the guidance that my organization was giving, call and check on your Black employees, which I think came from a good space, right? That you want to show up, you want your managers to be allies. And I'm telling you, by like the third call, I was like, don't call me no more, because it became labor for me to have discussions with people who I may not have had a really, really strong relationship with, but there is a power dynamic, and really trust is built from intimacy. Intimacy is built from over time. You consistently show me that, you are able to handle what I share. And so I think that, I just want to add that caveat, Vincent, since you got me to thinking that it's important to have the conversation, recognize that people may not want to have that conversation. When you have the conversation, listen and be prepared to take action. Thank you, Rodney, for letting me jump in there.
Sure. And I just wanted to tag on to what Vincent had talked about. So leaders of organizations really want employees to be invested in the organization, to be engaged. What better way for an organization to show that they're invested in their employees than to provide them the space that they need to have these conversations and to interact and be able to learn from each other and express, their lived experiences. I just wanted to make that point.
And really quickly, I know we're almost at time, but that just made me think about it. What Desiree and Vincent were talking about is that's the difference between check the box and an organization being authentic, right? So if you don't have a relationship with someone and they're just, oh, let me email all the folks that are, Black that I need to just check them, but you don't have a relationship with them, it doesn't come off as authentic. And so that's the thing that you have to be mindful of as well. Like, you have to be authentic, because people can tell. People can tell easily, especially in the movement that we have going on right now.
Great point, Alicia. Definitely great point.
I'll just, wow, yeah, I'm living this experience from two sides. One is a person with a disability, but also, as a visibly, I'm a white male, right? Like, there's a lot that I needed to learn. As a person who has a disability, I definitely, Desiree, feel you when you get tired of explaining. You get tired of, and we have to warn our folks in our courses and our training, look, you're probably going to be the only person in your office. Be prepared to be the token person that everyone comes to when an issue is on TV or something. And hey, how are you? And when I think about ways that you gaslight a person with a disability, the thing that comes to mind for me is the accommodation process. If I have to jump through a bunch of hoops to make sure that, can we buy you the $5 thing instead of the $10 thing? That just tells me that you care more about saving money than my ability to do my job. So for those listening there, I would say, look to what you're asking of your your employees with disabilities when you're thinking about accommodations. If they have to jump through a bunch of hoops, if they have to go to their doctor every time, if everything they ask for gets questioned, they're not going to ask. And when they don't ask, they're not effective. You end up firing, and you do get a reputation. Trust me. Everybody here is here because we at Starkloff trust them very much to be wonderful employers of people with disabilities, and they're doing great work. And we want everybody in the world, as Vincent said, the goal is to not have a job anymore. But until that day, we hope that you'll keep an open mind. I wanted to open up to Angie real quick before we end to talk more about the Dni Consortium. Tell us about what it is and how people can get involved.
Oh, thanks, Jason. I appreciate that. And thank you so much for, allowing me to be a part of this incredible conversation and being a part of this panel that's just absolutely amazing. So the Diversity and Inclusion Consortium is, it's in St. Louis. We are actually a spinoff from the Kansas City Consortium. There's over 200 individuals that are a part of this, and probably, I think it's about 125 St. Louis organizations. So we get together on a quarterly basis, at least a little bit more recently. We've had a lot to talk about. It's a great place for D&I professionals to get together to, in a safe space for us to really talk about the challenges that we're facing, questions, open forums. We go through a lot of development and professional development as well, and offer each other resources to help to advance diversity and inclusion throughout our organizations, our community, and of course, our community partners as well. To get involved, you can email me. So it's angela.cody@MNK, that's Mary Nancy Kite, so MNK.com. So feel free to email me, and I'm happy to put you onto the consortium. There's no cost. Join when you can. We send out great minutes, and we have a private LinkedIn page as well where you can share information. Thank you, Jason. I appreciate that.
Well, we appreciate it, Angie. You know, it was the Dni Consortium meeting, the first one we had, I think in March, that really inspired us at Starkloff to pursue this conversation, because I don't think there wasn't a person in the room who was expressing what has been expressed today, that a lot of you really felt like you were just fighting to keep leaders looking at your programs and keeping this conversation going. And I'm so heartened to hear that you've had such success. And I'm glad to hear too, like, I feel like this is going to become a movement. That doesn't mean we can relax, but it's, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion. This year, the E part wasn't a part of it. It was D and I, and now it's DE and I. And that tells me so much about how this field is changing. So on behalf of Starkloff, behalf of our audience, behalf of everybody involved, I want to thank each one of our panelists for taking the time to be with us today. I know we didn't get to all the questions. We had so many wonderful questions come up. We are going to record this on YouTube and post it there. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact us. We are, like I said, if you'd like to learn more about Starkloff Disability Institute, you can visit us at our website, www.starkloff.org. That's STARKLOFF. If you'd like to learn more about the Diversity and Inclusion Consortium, as Angie said, you can email her. We do have SHRM credits for this. We also want to thank our sponsors, Centene Charitable Foundation, Emerson, Nestle Purina, and the Society for Human Resource Management, St. Louis. So thank you, sponsors. And then do we have the SHRM? Here we go. So the SHRM and Hrci Ceu Code, it's going to be a general. It's going to be for 1.25 hours. Your code is org/program/535763. So that's Hrci credit code. And your SHRM credit code is going to be 20/ATV75. And if you have trouble finding those, feel free to email us and we will send them to you. Well, once more, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Angie, for helping us put this together. Thank you, Alicia, Jacqueline, Desiree, Vincent, Rodney. I appreciate all your time. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. And we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason,
Thank you.
Starkloff, and Angela. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.